In the gleaming, lavish ballroom of one of the world's most exclusive hotels, the air was thick with the buzz of wealthy socialites, businessmen, and celebrities. As champagne glasses clinked and laughter echoed, no one seemed to notice her at first. She entered quietly, wearing a simple, elegant black dress, her hair pulled back neatly but not overly done. She carried herself with a calm confidence that suggested she belonged here, yet no one in the room had any idea just who she was. But that would soon change. Moments later, a remark from one of the guests would shatter the calm. "What's she doing here?" a voice hissed loud enough for others to hear. "She doesn't belong in this crowd." The comment wasn't whispered, it was spoken with a sharpness, a certainty that sent ripples through the room. This wasn't just about the woman's appearance, it was a judgment on her very presence. The eyes of nearby guests flicked towards her, sizing her up, trying to figure out who she was, why she was here. She hadn't walked in with an entourage. No diamonds, no flashy clothes, no designer handbags, nothing that screamed CEO, at least not on the surface. But that didn't stop her from being the most powerful person in the room. Her calm didn't break. She stood still, absorbing the subtle yet stinging judgment. As the whispers grew louder, she felt a flicker of memory, a moment in her life when she'd been in a similar position. As a young woman, she had been dismissed, overlooked, called not enough, by those who thought their position in society gave them the right to judge others. She had learned to accept it, but today things were different. She was no longer that young woman trying to prove herself. She was now the woman who owned the very space she stood in, the woman who had built an empire. The whispers continued louder now. One guest snickered to another, "She looks like a janitor." "What's she doing in a place like this?" The insult was loud, and this time it wasn't just the woman who heard it. Heads turned. Others began to look at her with that same disdain. The air in the room shifted. There was tension now. She could feel it in the stares, the raised eyebrows, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the crowd. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled inwardly, knowing that the storm had already started, and she was the one in control. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Calmly, she dialed a number. Her voice was smooth, precise, and filled with authority as she spoke. "Start the protocol. It's time," she said to her assistant, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. In the blink of an eye, her entire team was activated. The woman who had once been judged and dismissed now had the power to rewrite the entire narrative. "Excuse me," a voice from the other side of the room interrupted the whispers. A low-ranking employee from the hotel had stepped forward, their expression, one of uncertainty, but also a flicker of recognition. Her name, Wait. She's the one who designed this entire space. She's the owner of this hotel. The words hung in the air. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze, as if time itself had been paused. The guests who had been laughing or judging now looked at each other in disbelief. They had no idea who they were dealing with. It wasn't the name or the title that held power in the room now. It was the unspoken truth that had just been revealed. The woman who had been treated as less than was not only part of this world, she owned it. The change in the air was palpable. The guests who had once looked down on her now shrank under her gaze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply stood in the center of the room, waiting, watching, as the weight of the moment bore down on those who had dared to insult her. With one final glance around the room, she turned to the employee who had spoken up and gave a small, imperceptible nod. The protocol had been activated, the systems were in motion, and the justice she was about to deliver would not be quick. No, it would be complete. With each passing second, the truth sunk in deeper. They hadn't just offended a woman, they had made the mistake of judging the wrong person in a room they would never truly understand. And they would all pay the price for it. By the end of the evening, the once cocky guest who had mocked her would find himself escorted out by security, his arrogance replaced by confusion and shame. The staff members who had participated in the subtle ostracism would find themselves out of work as her system flagged their behavior. She wouldn't need to explain why she had done it. Her actions would speak for themselves. And as the evening wrapped up, the woman once, a target of judgment, would leave the event in a quiet, yet undeniable victory. Not with loud proclamations, but with the satisfaction of seeing justice unfold naturally, quietly, and irrevocably. She had proven one simple thing: power doesn't need to shout. It simply exists. The tension in the room was palpable now, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The guests who had once looked at her with disdain now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between one another. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an awkward stillness that seemed to suffocate the space. The woman still standing near the center of the room didn't need to say anything further. Her presence alone commanded authority. She had become the focal point of the room, her quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once surrounded her. The guest who had insulted her earlier, now flushed with embarrassment, shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. He had thought he could reduce her to nothing, but now he was the one shrinking in the face of the truth. The moment had shifted entirely, and he could feel the weight of his mistake. As the realization hit him, he opened his mouth to apologize, but the words caught in his throat, unable to form. She didn't give him the satisfaction of an acknowledgement. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down at it. A quiet smile touched her lips as she read the message. Her team had already begun the process. The wheels of justice were in motion. She wasn't about to let this go. Not anymore. She had spent years building her empire, proving herself time and time again, and this moment, this humiliating display, would not be the end of her. It would be a lesson not just for the man who had insulted her, but for everyone who had ever looked down on her because of her race, her gender, or her appearance. Her assistant's message confirmed what she already knew. She had been right to test the waters. This was the exact reason why she had chosen to remain under the radar, to walk into this room unnoticed, only to reveal her true power when the time was right. She wasn't just a woman in a room full of the elite. She was the one who had built this room. The building, the design, the interior, the entire aesthetic had been her vision. And now she was about to make sure everyone in that room knew it. With a deep breath, she turned toward the guest who had insulted her earlier, still looking unsure of himself. Without a word, she walked toward him. The guests parted to let her pass, as if instinctively knowing something significant was about to happen. The man finally lifted his head, meeting her eyes for the first time. "You know," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the room, "I didn't design this place for people like you to feel comfortable. I designed it to bring power into the hands of those who deserve it." Her words were simple, yet they cut deep. The man's face turned pale as his stomach dropped. He realized in that instant that he was not in a room of his peers. He was in the presence of someone who had earned every right to be there. And now, she continued, her voice steady, "I think it's time for you to leave." The room seemed to hold its breath as the security team, already prepared for such an event, moved swiftly to escort the man out. His protest was feeble at best, and within minutes he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a ripple of realization through the remaining guests. The woman stood there, her gaze never wavering, as the last of the whispers faded into silence. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged, overlooked, or humiliated based on their appearance or background. She had turned the tables on them, not with force, but with grace and undeniable power. And as the event continued, it became clear the room had changed. The dynamics had shifted, and from that moment forward, no one would ever question her place in this world again. As the door closed behind the man, the room fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence, the air now thick with tension. No one spoke at first, as if unsure what to do next. But the woman standing tall at the center of the room made no effort to break the stillness. Her gaze swept across the crowd, her eyes calm yet piercing, as if silently commanding each of them to take stock of the moment. She knew the power of silence, how it could fill a room with more weight than any words could. Slowly, people began to shift in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Some of them looked at each other, unsure of what to make of what had just happened. Others stared at her with newfound respect, realizing that this woman was not who they had initially assumed. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the force that had orchestrated this entire evening, this entire event, and possibly the very building they were standing in. A low murmur started to ripple through the crowd, whispers of disbelief and curiosity. They couldn't reconcile the woman they had just seen with the one they now understood her to be. She wasn't some nameless attendee. They had underestimated her, dismissed her, and now they were facing the consequences of their assumptions. The woman remained unbothered by their newfound realizations. She had made her point. She had shown them who was in charge, and now she would continue to take control of the room, of the evening, of everything they thought they knew. She turned away from the crowd, walking slowly back to her seat. The soft sound of her heels on the marble floor echoed in the room, every step deliberate, every movement measured. As she sat down, she glanced briefly at her phone again. Another message. Her team was already handling the fallout from the incident, ensuring that everything was documented, that the people involved would be held accountable. The woman didn't need to say a word. Everything she needed to do was already in motion. She knew that her name would be on the lips of everyone in this room by the end of the night, but not in the way they had expected. She would leave them with something more than just gossip. She would leave them with respect. The evening continued, but it was different now. The atmosphere had shifted. The guests who had once looked at her with judgment were now watching her with a mixture of awe and fear. The rest of the event was a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. No one dared challenge her again, not after what had just unfolded. As the night wore on, the woman remained poised, composed, the epitome of grace and strength. She interacted with others as if nothing had happened, her presence commanding the space around her. But in the back of her mind, she was already thinking ahead, already planning the next steps. She had made a statement tonight, but this was just the beginning. This wasn't about one event, one interaction, or one confrontation. This was about changing the way people saw her, changing the way people saw all women, all black people, all those who had been underestimated and dismissed. She wasn't just going to be a moment in their lives. She was going to be a force, an undeniable presence that would shape the future. As the evening drew to a close, the guests began to file out of the room, their conversations quieter, their steps more cautious. The woman stood up and walked toward the exit, her head held high, the weight of her actions still reverberating in the air. She was no longer just an attendee at an event, she was the one who had set the tone, who had changed the course of the evening. And as she stepped into the night, she knew that this was only the beginning. The world was hers for the taking. As the night unfolded, the woman's mind was already several steps ahead. She had made her point at the event, but this was only a small part of a much larger game. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read the new messages. The legal team had already begun to escalate the situation internally, ensuring that the employees involved in the incident would be reprimanded. It was a systematic approach, one she had perfected over the years, a quiet storm of consequences that didn't rely on force, but on the efficiency of the systems she had put in place. Her empire was vast, and she had learned long ago that the key to maintaining power was control. Control over situations, control over people, and most importantly, control over her own narrative. The woman walked toward the exit, the sound of her heels clicking in rhythm with the pulse of her thoughts. She had made an impact tonight, but now it was time to reflect. She didn't need to gloat. She didn't need to bask in the moment. That wasn't her style. Instead, she focused on the long term. This wasn't just about one person in that room. This was about shifting the entire perception of who she was and what she represented. She wasn't just a woman in a powerful position. She was a force to be reckoned with, one whose reputation would precede her wherever she went. The next day, the news would spread quickly. It wasn't just gossip, it was a statement. A black woman, quietly confident and poised, had taken control of a room filled with the elite, and in one swift move had shown them that power isn't about noise. Power is about presence. Her name would be in the headlines, and not because she had shouted her way into the spotlight, but because she had changed the narrative with a single act of quiet defiance. People would talk about her, about the way she had turned the tables on those who had underestimated her. But this wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. It was a pattern, one she was accustomed to. From the moment she had entered the world of business, she had been dismissed, overlooked, and told that she didn't belong. But each time she had proven them wrong, climbing higher, building stronger, and leaving those who doubted her in the dust. Now, with each step she took, she was forging a path that no one would be able to follow. The night ended, and the woman left the event with the same quiet strength that had carried her through so many similar moments. She wasn't just walking out of that building, she was walking into the next phase of her journey, where the obstacles would only grow tougher, but so would her resolve. As she stepped into the black car waiting for her outside, she looked out at the city, a landscape full of endless possibilities. There would be challenges ahead, but she wasn't afraid of them. She knew that no matter how hard the fight would be, she had already won. The next chapter was hers for the taking. The following morning, as the woman sat at her desk sipping her coffee, the city outside her office window seemed quieter, more focused. It was as if the night before had shaken something loose, a ripple that spread further than she had imagined. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up, reading through the dozens of messages that had come in overnight. The event was already the topic of conversation, not just among her peers, but in the wider media. News outlets were picking up on the story not the way they had expected. It wasn't just about the confrontation, it was about the woman behind it, the woman who had quietly asserted her power in the most sophisticated way. The reporters were eager to spin the narrative, but they were careful. They couldn't ignore the sheer force of her actions, nor the impact it had on those who had underestimated her. The woman smiled to herself as she read through the headlines, "Black CEO takes control in stunning show of quiet power elite event." Shaken by subtle defiance, she didn't need to yell. A masterclass in turning the tables. It wasn't just the headlines that struck her, it was the message they carried. The power of presence, the impact of grace under pressure had become the core of the story. This was no longer just about one night or one incident. This was about setting a new precedent, showing a world that had long underestimated her that there was power in silence, in restraint, and in quiet strength. The room at the event, the people who had doubted her, she knew they were still talking about her, still processing the events of the night before. She had not only made a statement, she had made them rethink everything. What did it mean for them now to be so easily dismissive of someone they thought was not worthy? What did it mean to mistake silence for weakness? It was a powerful message, one that would resonate with anyone who had ever been treated as less than because of who they were. The woman leaned back in her chair, looking out at the city once more. She knew she had just changed the game. She hadn't used loud words or dramatic gestures. She hadn't stormed in demanding attention. She had simply shown up as herself, and in doing so had rewritten the narrative that so many had tried to impose on her. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from her assistant. She answered with a simple, "What's the update?" Her assistant's voice was calm and efficient as always, reporting that the fallout from the incident was already being handled. The employees involved were being called in for meetings, the first steps of disciplinary action were being taken, and the press was already shifting its tone. No one could deny what had happened. The moment had been too significant. The woman's influence had gone far beyond what she had anticipated. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about getting back at anyone. It was about making it clear that respect couldn't be given based on appearance, that no one had the right to belittle others, especially not those who were paving the way for change. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment, letting everything settle in. She had done it. She had taken control of her narrative, and now it was time to move forward. There were more battles to fight, more goals to achieve, but the foundation had been laid. The world was changing, and she would be at the forefront of it. The days that followed were a whirlwind, but the woman felt an unmistakable sense of calm. Her actions had set things in motion, and now the world was watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. The ripple effect from the previous night had spread, and there was no going back. She had made an impact not through brute force or anger, but through a quiet, deliberate display of power. It was a reminder to everyone, especially to those who had doubted her, that she was not to be underestimated. But even as the press buzzed with coverage and the public whispered about the woman who had shifted the dynamic in an elite room, she kept her focus. She didn't let the media frenzy distract her. She knew better than anyone that true power didn't come from headlines or fleeting moments of attention. True power came from building something that would last, something that would outlive the noise. And that was exactly what she was doing. Her company's progress had not slowed. In fact, it had accelerated. The teams she led were moving faster, more efficiently, and with a renewed sense of purpose. The incident at the event had only strengthened their resolve. She had proven a point not just to the world, but to her employees, to the people who had been with her from the beginning, who had believed in her when others hadn't. Her phone continued to buzz with messages, updates, and calls. It seemed like the entire world wanted to weigh in on what had happened, but she wasn't interested in the opinions of the masses. She was focused on the future, on her vision, and on the long-term goals she had set for herself and her company. The next step was clear. She would continue to expand her influence, not by bending to the whims of those who had tried to push her down, but by creating an empire that would not only thrive, but led. Her focus was sharper than ever. She didn't need to seek validation from others. She had learned long ago that true success came from within, from trusting her instincts and knowing her worth. The woman sat at her desk, reviewing the next phase of her plan, knowing that the challenges ahead would only grow more complex. But she was ready. She had already faced the hardest parts of the journey, and this was just the beginning. As she looked over the proposal in front of her, she couldn't help but smile to herself. The world had underestimated her, but she had always known her own worth. She had always known that one day the world would catch up to her, and when it did, she would be ready. She would be more than just a name on a page or a headline in a story. She would be a force, one that would change the narrative for good. The woman stood up, her mind already moving forward. And as she left her office for the next meeting, She walked with the quiet confidence that had carried her through so many challenges before. She was no longer the underdog. She was the one setting the pace, and the world was now watching her lead. Weeks passed, but the impact of the previous night still lingered in the air. The woman had moved forward, focusing on the tasks ahead, but she couldn't ignore the subtle changes that were happening around her. There were still whispers, but now they were different. People no longer questioned her place in the room, they respected it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the power of her presence in every interaction, in every decision. It wasn't just the media coverage or the public acknowledgement. It was the quiet shift in how people saw her. Her team was more unified, driven by the example she had set. The incident had become a rallying point, not just a story of personal triumph, but a lesson in resilience and power. But the woman knew better than to rest on her laurels. She had made her mark, but that was only part of the bigger picture. She wasn't interested in short-term victories. She had a vision that extended far beyond the walls of any room or event. Her goals had always been long-term, and now more than ever she was focused on expanding her empire, pushing boundaries and breaking down barriers. She had learned that the road to true influence was never a straight path. It was a journey filled with setbacks, challenges, and obstacles, but it was also a journey of growth, evolution, and learning. As she sat in her office going through the details of her company's next major project, her mind raced with possibilities. She wasn't just thinking about what was next for her. She was thinking about what was next for the world. She had always believed that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about lifting others along the way. Her rise was a testament to the power of perseverance, of fighting for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. But she also understood that her journey was a collective one. The success of her company, the impact she was having, was not just for her, but for the people she worked with, the communities she represented, and the future she was shaping. She stood up from her desk, her gaze steady as she looked out over the city. The skyline, once distant, now felt like a symbol of everything she had built and everything that was still to come. The challenges ahead were still daunting, but she was ready. Her journey had only just begun, and with each passing day, her influence would continue to grow. She wasn't just a black CEO. She was a trailblazer, someone who had proven that no one, no matter their background, could be written off or diminished. She was a living example of what could be achieved when you refused to be held back by others' limited views. As she prepared to leave the office for another meeting, she knew that the path she was walking was one of purpose. The world had watched her take control of her narrative, and now they would watch her change the world. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about shaping the future, building a legacy that would stand the test of time. And as she walked out of her office, ready to face the next challenge, she felt more certain than ever that nothing would stop her from achieving her vision. As the weeks went by, the woman's reputation continued to grow. What had begun as a quiet statement of power had evolved into a movement, one that was reverberating through the corporate world. She had not only proven herself to be a force to be reckoned with, she had demonstrated the kind of leadership that inspired those around her. Her team, once skeptical and hesitant, was now united by a shared sense of purpose. They admired her not just for her accomplishments, but for the grace with which she carried herself through every challenge. The impact of her actions was felt throughout the company, and soon even competitors began to take notice. They could see the momentum building, and while they may have once dismissed her, they now understood that she was playing the long game. She wasn't just another executive. She was a visionary. Her phone rang again. It was her assistant. "The board is ready to move forward with the next phase," her assistant said, his voice efficient and focused. "Everything is set for the announcement next week." The woman nodded, her mind already running through the next steps. This was the moment she had been working toward, the next big leap in her career, and the one that would cement her legacy. She had spent years building her empire, overcoming obstacles, and fighting against a system that had tried to limit her. But now she was about to take it all to the next level. She hung up the phone and stood up from her desk, walking toward the window. The city stretched out before her, a landscape of possibilities. She had done more than just build a business. She had created a movement, a platform for those who had been overlooked and marginalized. She had proven that success wasn't just about fitting into the system, it was about reshaping it, breaking down barriers, and making space for others to thrive. The announcement next week would be a turning point. It wasn't just about her, it was about the future she was creating for others. She wasn't just an individual success story, she was a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to let the world define them. As she turned away from the window, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was her time. The future was in her hands, and she was ready to take it. The road ahead would not be easy, but she had already faced the hardest battles. She had fought for her place in the world, and now she was ready to lead it. Her phone buzzed again this time with a message from her legal team. Everything was falling into place. She smiled, knowing that the next phase of her journey was about to begin. She wasn't just going to be a part of the conversation, she was going to lead it. As she left her office ready to meet with her team and finalize the details, she knew that her journey had only just begun. The world had underestimated her once, but they would never do it again. She was no longer just a CEO, she was a trailblazer, a game changer, and the world would soon see her as the force that would shape the future. The following week arrived with the kind of anticipation that only comes from knowing a pivotal moment in your life is just around the corner. The woman spent the day in her office reviewing the final details of the announcement. She had always been meticulous, and today was no different. Every aspect of the press release, every word in her speech, every strategic move had been carefully planned and executed. The board was aligned, the media prepared, and her team was ready to back her every step of the way. As she sat at her desk, her eyes flicked over the proposal in front of her, her mind racing through the next steps. She had fought for this moment, fought to be taken seriously, fought to create a space for herself and others like her. Now the time had come to step into the spotlight. She wasn't just making an announcement. She was making history. She took a deep breath, as if steadying herself for what was about to unfold. The phone buzzed on her desk once more. It was her assistant again, this time confirming that everything was in place. "We are ready, ma'am. The press is waiting, and all logistics are finalized." She gave a small nod, her heart rate steady, her face calm. "Let's do it," she replied, her voice carrying the confidence that had defined her journey. The press conference was scheduled to take place at one of the company's most iconic locations, a testament to everything she had built. As she arrived at the venue, the hum of anticipation filled the air. The media was already setting up the cameras, rolling the lights bright, and the eyes of the world all fixed on her. She had been in this position before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't just another executive with a story to tell. This time, she was rewriting the narrative. As she stepped onto the stage, the room went silent. Every person in that space knew that this wasn't just a typical corporate announcement. This was a turning point not just for her, but for the industry, for those who had been excluded, and for those who had been held back by the constraints of a system that didn't want to change. The woman stood tall, her eyes scanning the room of reporters and cameras, her posture exuding strength and purpose. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady yet filled with authority. "Today marks the beginning of something new. Today, we are announcing not just a shift in the industry, but a change in the way we see leadership, a change in the way we see success." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The reporters were listening, their pens poised, their cameras trained on her. For too long, too many have been excluded from the conversation. For too long, those who look like me, who come from where I come from, have been told that they don't belong, that they aren't capable, that they can't lead. But I'm here to tell you today those days are over. We are taking back our narrative, we are taking back our power, and we will be the ones to shape the future. The room was still a collective breath, held in anticipation of what would come next. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of her words, and the shift that was happening around her. This wasn't just about her story. It was about every person who had been told they couldn't succeed, every person who had been told their dreams were too big, every person who had been dismissed because of their background or appearance. The announcement was more than just a company initiative. It was a declaration of independence, a declaration that she and others like her would no longer be overlooked. And as she finished her speech, she stepped back, feeling the power of what she had just said. The future had already begun to change, and it was hers to shape. The days following the announcement were filled with a mix of media coverage, internal meetings, and discussions with key stakeholders. The woman watched as the world began to shift around her, and she knew that the moment she had created would have a lasting impact, not just on her company, but on the broader industry as well. The press had been both captivated and surprised by her words. What was initially seen as a corporate statement had quickly become a movement, a call for change that resonated far beyond her own industry. The phone calls started coming in, requests for interviews, invitations to speak at conferences, and even offers for partnerships with other companies eager to align with the powerful message she had delivered. But she didn't let the attention distract her. The woman was laser-focused on what was ahead, and she knew that this moment, as important as it was only the beginning. The real work was just starting. She sat at her desk, reviewing the reports from the marketing and public relations teams. The response from the public had been overwhelmingly positive. Social media was abuzz with praise people from all walks of life, applauding her for speaking truth to power and challenging the status quo. But the woman also knew that with success came opposition. Not everyone would be on her side. There would be those who resented her message, who would work behind the scenes to discredit her, to undermine what she had built. But she was ready for that. She had faced opposition before, and each time she had come out stronger. She knew that the real test wasn't how many people supported her, but how she responded to those who tried to tear her down. The woman leaned back in her chair, taking a moment to reflect. She thought back to the early days of her career when she had been dismissed by others, overlooked because of her race and gender. She had always known that the world would not give her a seat at the table, she would have to take it for herself. And that's exactly what she had done. She had built an empire from nothing, fought through every challenge, and now she was at the forefront of a movement that was bigger than herself. It wasn't just about proving people wrong anymore. It was about setting a new standard, about creating a space for others who had been marginalized, ignored, and told they didn't belong. She had changed the game, and she wasn't about to stop now. The challenges ahead would be great, but she was more than ready. The industry had seen her power, and now they would see her vision unfold. She would continue to rise, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been held back by the limitations of an unjust system. The woman stood up from her desk, her eyes scanning the city below her, and for a moment she let herself feel the weight of what she had accomplished. But only for a moment. There was more work to do, more battles to fight, more ground to gain. The future was waiting for her, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. As the months went on, the woman's influence continued to grow, her reputation solidifying in ways she had always envisioned. The world had taken notice of her message, but it was the actions that followed her words that truly set her apart. The press coverage slowed, but the impact of her announcement echoed through the corporate world. What had once seemed like a bold statement had turned into a new standard, a shift in the way leadership was viewed, especially in spaces where she had once been excluded. She had built something bigger than herself, something that would outlast any headline or momentary applause. But she was not the type to rest on her laurels. Every victory, every success was just another step toward a greater goal. The phone calls continued, the partnerships flourished, and her company expanded rapidly. But the woman knew that with success came greater scrutiny, and as her power grew, so did the responsibility. She felt it more deeply now, the weight of representing something larger than her own ambitions. She was no longer just a CEO. She had become the face of a movement, a symbol of what was possible for those who had long been overlooked and dismissed. But it was not just about breaking down barriers for herself. It was about creating lasting change for others. Every decision she made, every project she launched, was done with that purpose in mind. As she walked through the headquarters, she was met with nods of respect from her employees. The atmosphere within the company had shifted too. People were more inspired, more motivated to work toward a shared vision. Her message had resonated with them, and they now felt empowered to push boundaries in their own roles. But with the growth came challenges. There were always those who wanted to maintain the status quo, who were threatened by her success and the changes she was advocating for. And while she had prepared herself for this kind of resistance, it didn't make it any easier to deal with. She spent long hours in meetings, strategizing with her legal team and advisors, making sure that every step she took was calculated and impactful. She had already faced enough obstacles in her career to know that it wasn't enough to simply rise to the occasion. You had to outmaneuver those who would try to bring you down. But through it all, she never lost sight of her mission. Every setback was simply a lesson, every roadblock, an opportunity to demonstrate the strength and resilience that had defined her journey from the very beginning. In private moments, she would reflect on how far she had come, on the years of hard work, the countless sacrifices, and the relentless pursuit of her dreams. It had never been easy, but it had always been worth it. And now, standing at the pinnacle of her career, she realized that she had only just begun. She was not done with her work. The world still had much to learn from her. As she looked out the window of her office, watching the city stretch out beneath her, she knew that her journey would continue. The path ahead would be filled with more obstacles, more challenges, but she was ready. She had made it this far, and now nothing would stand in her way. The flight was almost at cruising altitude, and the woman had settled into her seat, ready to catch up on some work. She always preferred to take the quieter moments in her day to reflect, plan, and prepare for what was next. But today was different. Across the aisle, a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed, stood up abruptly. Her face flushed with indignation as she marched toward the woman's seat, her gaze locked on the woman who was minding her own business. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, her voice cutting through the low hum of the cabin. "I believe you're in my seat." The words were delivered with an air of superiority, as if the woman had no right to be sitting there in the first place. The woman, calm and composed, looked up from her laptop, not showing the slightest sign of being rattled. She had experienced moments like this before, and she wasn't about to let this one derail her day. "I'm sorry, but I believe I'm in the right seat," she replied, her voice measured but firm. The woman, pointing at her seat, clearly expecting an apology or a retreat, was taken aback by the calm, collected response. The cabin was filled with a sense of tension as passengers started to notice the exchange unfolding. Some seemed uncomfortable shifting in their seats, while others watched with rapt attention. The confrontation continued to escalate, with the woman now pointing at the screen in front of the woman's seat as if the seat assignment was somehow in dispute. "This is 14B, not 14 amperes, she insisted, as though it was the most logical thing in the world that the woman didn't belong in this part of the plane. For a brief moment, the woman remained, still allowing the other to speak, giving her the chance to make her point. She knew that it wasn't just about a seat. It was about the assumption that she didn't belong in a space of privilege, and she was ready to address that. The woman finally spoke, her voice steady but now carrying a hint of underlying power. "I've checked my seat assignment and I'm in 14B. If you check again, you'll see it's correct." The woman, stunned for a moment, hesitated. It was clear she hadn't expected this level of composure. For a fleeting second, she almost apologized, but the pride on her face made it clear that wouldn't happen. Instead, she turned and huffed, walking back to her seat. The woman didn't need to engage further. She didn't need to explain who she was or why she was in first class. The look on the other woman's face as she walked away told the woman everything she needed to know. She had won this battle not with words, but with her presence. Once again, she had shown the world that no one could define her worth, and that no matter where she was, she belonged. As the flight continued, the woman leaned back in her seat, returning to her work. She had faced yet another instance of being underestimated, and she had responded in the only way that mattered, with quiet dignity. In that moment, she knew that no matter what the world threw at her, she was prepared to meet it head-on, just as she always had.